It is Scotland's most notorious double murder, which sparked a nationwide manhunt spanning 4 decades.
We were never going to let this rest until we got the persons that were responsible.
The brutal killings of Edinburgh teenagers Helen Scott and Christine Eady in 1977 shocked the nation and left 2 families devastated.
It's been 30-year punishment, I suppose. They're not looking for sympathy. They're just looking for justice. That's all I'm looking for.
No one has been convicted of these killings, but tonight we look at the evidence against prime suspect Angus Sinclair.
He was one of the most evil people I've certainly interviewed in my life. There were things going on in his head that clearly I couldn't reach.
We uncover the warning signs that were ignored and investigate Sinclair's links to another 4 murders.
After our analysis, I felt very strongly that all these crimes had been committed by the same offender.
This is the story of how Scotland's secret serial killer escaped detection for so long, and we ask if he could ever be brought to justice.
I think as technology increases and our advances in that area, in all sorts of areas increase, I think we should bring people to justice who previously have escaped it.
Saturday, October 15th, 1977. 4 friends were off for an evening out. They visited various pubs, but ended up at the World's End on Edinburgh's Royal Mile.
What can I get you?
Christine Eady and Helen Scott had no idea of the fate that awaited them that night. Tom Wood was a young detective at the time.
Young women, but really teenage girls, go out for the night, and they start, as was common in that time, to go out to see what the action was like in a number of pubs in and around the high street. Arriving here mid to late evening.
Around 200 people came and went from the pub that night, and many were familiar to the girls. But witnesses later told police of 2 men whom no one knew and who were interested in Helen and Christine.
These were 2 complete strangers, 2 people who nobody recognised. And they were variously described, but they were obviously out-of-towners.
The 2 other girls decided to go on to an impromptu party.
Now, by that time, they were getting on well with the 2 guys, and a decision was made that no, they wouldn't go to the party, they would stay with their newfound friends. It was a critical decision, obviously, and the decision that probably led to the end of their lives.
According to statements, the girls were spotted leaving the pub around 11, accompanied at a distance by the 2 older men. These men would later become the prime suspects. Helen and Christine were never seen alive again. When Helen didn't arrive home as expected, her parents were worried. It was totally out of character.
I don't think she'd been out for 2 or 3 weeks, you know. We were up quite late, and I said, oh, she'll have gone to somebody's house or something. And I went up to bed. I didn't really sleep, but her mum says, I'll wait up, you know. And in fact, her mum stayed up most of the night.
But the families wouldn't wait long for news.
Christine was discovered about 2 o'clock. There was a couple out walking along the coast here. She was found naked in this instance, clothing totally removed, lying on her back, just down from the road, say about 10 yards down from the roadway. She was bound and gagged with items of her own clothing, her tights and her pants, and ultimately we would find out that she'd been strangled with items of her own garments as well. Quite a tragic scene, actually.
Meanwhile, Helen's anxious parents were still waiting for her to walk through the door. Then they heard.
Something came over the radio at 4 o'clock that a body had been found. And then we heard later on that another one had been found down East Lothian. And it was then, just after that, we got a phone call from the police that said we'd like to look at a coat. And right away it was Helen's coat. It was the new one she'd just bought.
The sight of Helen's coat signalled the beginning of the nightmare for Moraine Scott and his family. But ironically, years later, it would be this coat that would lead police directly to the prime suspect.
And this area here, the space in the wall, that's the area where we've got a line of sight into where Helen was deposited. About 30, 40 yards within their line, face down, on the ground. Her hands had been tied behind her back by parts of her own clothing, and there were also ligatures around her neck, again items from her own clothing, belt and tights and the like. And ultimately she had been strangled by these, fashioned items out of her own clothing.
Very young sergeant in the CID administration, but there was a real feeling. I mean, you could sense the atmosphere changed because this was different. It kind of stopped Edinburgh in its tracks. How could two young girls be spirited away from the middle of Edinburgh, cosy, old-fashioned, quaint Edinburgh, and be brutally murdered?
The World's End killings would be one of Britain's longest-running manhunts. It would be almost 30 years before this photo fit was identified as Angus Robertson Sinclair. He became the prime suspect in World's End. And tonight, we investigate evidence of his links to another 4 murders. I've uncovered a psychiatrist's report about Sinclair. It says, "He is obsessed by sex. I do not think that any form of psychotherapy is likely to benefit his condition, and he will constitute a danger from now onwards." But this wasn't written after the World's End murders. It was written when he was just a boy, and its chilling warnings would not be heeded. So I started my investigation in the place Angus Sinclair grew up, and where his criminal career began.
This is St Peter Street.
The tenements are long gone, but former neighbour Lawrence Cumming remembers the area well, and young Angus as an outsider.
Any kid that lived in the area, including Angus Sinclair, would play in this street. But my recollection of him was standing against the wall of the close, looking at all the other kids playing and not joining in with the other kids. He was quite a loner of a little boy, yeah.
Sinclair was born in 1945, the youngest of 3 siblings. His elder brother John has never spoken publicly about Angus before. He's asked not to be identified because he doesn't want his grandchildren knowing who they are related to.
They roamed about at that time. There was no really parental, when my father died, there was no parental control really to him. It wasn't a case of him getting into bad company, I think he was a bad company.
He was already involved in petty crime, but much worse was to come. In 1961, here in this Glasgow street where Sinclair used to live, he carried out his first sex attack on an 8-year-old girl. He was put on probation, but that would be no deterrent because he was on an offending pattern which he would stick to throughout his adult life. And just 6 months later, he would kill for the first time.
Angus Sinclair had been a neighbour of Catherine Rehill and had sent her on an errand to get a message for him or to get something for him. And when she came back to the house,
he had attacked her, sexually assaulted her. During the actual commission of the crime, the door knocker had gone, and Angus Sinclair had had the presence of mind to answer the door, fob off whoever was at the door, and return to the offence. Remarkably cool, remarkably organised for a boy.
The calculated manner in which young Angus covered his tracks shocked police. It was a chilling insight into how he behaved under pressure. He even called the ambulance himself minutes after throwing Catherine's body down the stairs.
He didn't run away, didn't remove himself from the scene, as many would have done, but stayed to organise and make sure that he was in control.
So how did Sinclair actually kill this little girl?
Strangulation and blunt force.
He gave a false alibi and even pretended to help the investigation. But very quickly, he emerged as the only suspect. Detectives couldn't get him to confess to Catherine's rape and murder, so they turned to John.
Police hadn't been getting anywhere with their interviewing with him?
No, he was just clammed up. And I looked up and I says, look, if he's done it, I says, admit it. And it took me about half an hour, I think, to get him to admit it. He wasn't crying or anything. He didn't seem to be all that alarmed about being caught. No, just as if nothing had happened, really.
He didn't seem remorseful at all?
No, he didn't, no. He was a cold wee boy, really. A cold wee boy. But after that, I just washed my hands of it. That was it.
He had proved himself to be cold and calculating. The ligature he used to strangle Catherine was a bicycle inner tube. Remember the psychiatrist's report? It went on to say, given the minimum of opportunity, he will repeat these offences, irrespective of what promises he may give to the contrary. The warning signs were all there. And John wishes he'd seen them and stopped his younger brother in his tracks.
I'd have done time for him. I would have killed him. If I'd known years and years ago, I'd have pushed him in the bloody canal. There you are. And all these people, all these girls and that, and all these young kids would never have had that. But I just cannot understand how any human being can do that to anybody.
Sinclair was given 10 years for killing Catherine, but served just 7. Whilst in prison, he learned painting and decorating skills, and on his release in 1967, he soon found a job. His work records show that Sinclair was a good employee. He got married about that time. He also had a child, so to many, he seemed like a reformed character. But it was all a big deception, because he was leading a double life. I've discovered evidence of a brutal attack he carried out with another man in 1976. Sinclair's never been charged, but it bore all the hallmarks of the burgeoning criminal he was becoming. I tracked down the 7-year-old victim, now a grown woman. She has never spoken publicly of the ordeal she and her father suffered at Sinclair's hands.
Two men came from either side of the door with masks over their heads, and one had tights pulled over their heads, and one was brandishing a knife and the other had a hammer. We got taken into the living room and the two of us had to lie face down, and they gagged both of us and our arms behind our backs and bound us, and then bound our ankles.
After tying them up, Sinclair lay in wait, knowing the rent man was due to arrive. He then launched into a frenzied attack with a claw hammer before fleeing with hundreds of pounds.
And they told us we were to lie there, we hadn't to move to give them time to get away.
Incredibly, this took place during Sinclair's lunch hour from his painting job. I wondered what being able to carry out a vicious attack like this, yet act like nothing had happened, tells us about someone's psychology.
They are the monster, but they don't look like the monster. They don't act like the monster. Most of these individuals are psychopaths. It's what allows them to kill someone, rape someone, mutilate someone, and then half an hour later, be eating a ham sandwich as if nothing had happened. It's what allows them to go back to the people that they know, family members, friends, co-workers, and act as normal as anybody else. And it's that sort of mask of normalcy.
The people who came into our home that day, they didn't just steal money. They robbed the whole lot of us, feeling safe.
I've discovered Sinclair evaded capture for this crime because police charged the wrong man. Detectives only learned of the real culprits because Sinclair's accomplice confessed many years later. Sinclair's lucky escape allowed him to grow in confidence and perfect his modus operandi, or MO. His Jekyll and Hyde character had emerged, and this incident would eventually provide authorities with a valuable insight into his criminal profile.
Whilst the Yorkshire Ripper was terrorising England, the central belt of Scotland was about to see an unprecedented spate of horrific murders. Between June and December 1977, 6 young women would die in almost identical circumstances. So the question was this the work of multiple killers or a lone psychopath?
First in the sequence was Frances Barker. She was last seen drinking with friends in Glasgow's Maryhill Road. Her body was found 2 weeks later, dumped on wasteland. She had been strangled. Police documents reveal Sinclair had lived in this very street and he was known to pick up women here. Next, Anna Kenny. Like Frances, she had spent the evening in the pub. She was last seen trying to get a taxi in Townhead, Glasgow. It would be almost 2 years before her remains were discovered in a shallow grave in Argyll, nearby to where Sinclair spent his honeymoon. Third in the sequence was Hilda Macaulay, just 2 weeks before the World's End murders. If this was the work of one killer, he was becoming more prolific. Hilda was last seen around the Plaza Ballroom in Glasgow. I've tracked down Grace. She was a friend of Hilda's and one of the last people to see her alive.
The plaza was over there, and there was always queues, right? And the queue would be at least the end of that building, right? And it was always busy.
Like so many Glaswegians, Hilda Macaulay loved the dancing and went most weekends. For the hard-working single mother of 2 sons, it was a respite from the daily grind.
Well, her boys were her life, right? And that's what she lived for, her home, and her mother, and her boys.
And then her Saturday night was just...
A Saturday night was an escape from housework chores that most people have nowadays.
The evening started out as normal. Hilda visited a couple of pubs before heading to the plaza on Glasgow's south side. This was just around the corner from where Sinclair worked at the time. Could this have been a coincidence?
And so it wasn't unusual then for you all to come in and just do your own thing?
Not unusual. You know, you possibly would say, right, I'll meet you here, right? But if somebody was up dancing with somebody and stayed on for a few dances, and you'd miss each other.
Hilda would seemingly vanish that night. Her partially naked body was discovered the next day in woods in Langbank, Renfrewshire. I've learned this was also an area well known to Sinclair. On the Monday, Grace was called into her personnel office.
I just thought they were there, excuse me, to tell me that something happened to my daughter. Because I had to say later on, did you say to me that Hilda's dead? And they said, actually what the words were, there's nothing surer. And that was the first that I'd heard.
It must have been a shock.
Unbelievable. Sorry.
2 weeks later, World's End teenagers Helen and Christine were murdered in Edinburgh. But the killing spree wasn't finished yet. Agnes was a trainee nurse who, since her mother's death, had looked after her 5 younger siblings. She was killed like the others, but in a further escalation of violence, she'd been stabbed in the neck. So within a 7-month period in 1977, 6 young women had been brutally murdered.
All had been bound and gagged, mostly with items from their own clothing. All of the killings appear to have a sexual motive, and all of the bodies had been dumped, like pieces of rubbish, on remote areas of farmland or on waste ground.
This suggests that these murders were linked, but I needed to talk to an expert. The FBI's elite behavioural analysis unit in Quantico, Virginia, was made famous by the film Silence of the Lambs. Special Agent Mark Safarik recently retired after spending more than 20 years as a criminal profiler specialising in sexually motivated murders.
We had multiple areas of linkage. And also, you also, sometimes you have to step back, sort of look at the big picture. You have really a relatively small geographic area. You have Glasgow and you have Edinburgh, and you have a relatively short time frame. You have 6 months, from June through December of 1977. On its surface, you might say, well, there's a good chance, if you knew nothing about the cases, that they might be linked to one another, especially when you have 4 of the victims disappearing from Glasgow.
It might seem obvious to the FBI, but back in 1977, policing methods were more primitive and the crimes hadn't been connected. Agnes Cooney, the last victim in the sequence, had battled bravely for her life, and Safarik believes this could have been significant.
She stabbed in the neck, so the area that the offender has focused on in the past, the neck, is still the focus here. She stabbed the neck. She has other injuries, other incised injuries that suggest that she was a fighter. She fought back. That may have been very different for this offender. He didn't have fighters in the past.
He told me that this type of incident can lead to offenders picking softer targets.
I think children are much more vulnerable, and they present an easy target population. And as offenders get older, sometimes they just aren't physically in a position to continue with their crimes.
If Mark Safarik is right, then Angus Sinclair's spate of crimes from 1978, when the murders seemed to cease, could be extremely significant. Sinclair had started raping and indecently assaulting children across Glasgow. His technique was simple, and similar to how he lured 8-year-old Catherine Rehall to her death all those years ago. He'd ask a youngster to run an errand or help him look for something in a tenement close, then follow them inside before pouncing. Lynn was just 6 when she was approached outside her aunt's door.
I think it was me that says to him, what you're looking for, because he looked as if he was looking for something, It's stupid now, but there was nothing there. But I'm only 6. And he asked me if I wanted to go and help him find his tennis balls. And away we went.
Jean was also assaulted by Sinclair. She doesn't want to be identified as she's never spoken openly about her ordeal.
He asked me if I could do him a favour and go and take his mum's change up to him. And he told me what clothes and what door and what name. I seen him coming up, I seen his jacket, I knew exactly what he was wearing. And I kind of knew then that, this isn't right.
He told me I had a knife, I had a swimming costume on. And I remember him pulling that away. And I knew that wasn't right. And I'm trying to turn round and he's pushing me against the wall to stop me from turning round. By this point I'm getting hysterical. But I remember feeling wet at the back. And I was shaking. And then he started walking down the stairs.
There was no lights or anything, and he had taken me down the dungeon. right at the back bit where the close is, so that you're practically at the back. I thought if I scream or make a noise or anything, if someone doesn't come out, then he'll just kill me.
As soon as it was safe, Jean ran home.
My dad went round, obviously I had told him what had happened and where it had happened, and he came back with my jacket, and I had said to him, well, I don't have my pants, but he said they weren't there, so I don't know what happened. But I kind of knew then that, you know, something bad had happened, and although you're 9, you still know that that was wrong.
Lynn told police her attacker had flecks of paint in his hair and clothes. It led them to decorator Sinclair, whom she picked out at an identity parade.
I remember seeing his number, and I remember saying, I think it's him. And he kept asking me, and I kept saying, I think it's him.
Sinclair pleaded guilty to 3 rapes and 7 indecent assaults. He was again examined by psychiatrists, who concluded that he represented a permanent menace to children. 21 years after that first damning assessment, the prognosis was exactly the same. Little comfort, though, to his child victims, which he himself admitted could have numbered in the hundreds.
By 1982, he was in Peterhead. He secured a coveted kitchen job and was seen as a model prisoner. Despite the many warnings flagged about Sinclair and his risk to children throughout the years, once again, his potential for re-offending was not taken seriously. And this can be clearly demonstrated by a shocking lapse in judgment and security that I've uncovered.
He'd been given day release to attend the annual Boats Festival here in this picturesque village of Portsoy. He was unsupervised for much of that weekend, and his job had been to operate a stall selling, of all things, children's toys that he'd been allowed to make in prison.
Philip English was the manager of the prison's social work department at the time. He hadn't been informed of the plan to allow Sinclair to mingle freely around children in the small community in Scotland's northeast.
I learned about the fact that Mr. Sinclair went to the boat festival some time after it had taken place. I was very concerned when I heard that this had taken place, and had this very full and frank discussion with the governor at the time, and made my position very clear.
This is footage from the Portsoy Small Boats Festival in 1994, attended by Sinclair. The organisers, parents and children there were all oblivious to the paedophile wandering around in their midst.
This was a convicted killer and multiple child rapist, operating a stall selling children's toys, presumably to children. I mean, what was the prison thinking about?
I think that's a question best directed towards the prison service. But from the social work perspective, we were very deeply concerned about this and made our feelings known to the prison service.
So did you put a stop to it?
As to the best of my knowledge, this never happened again with Mr. Sinclair.
We have no evidence that any children were abused by Sinclair that weekend. But I've learned that the current prison management were flabbergasted by this lapse. A spokesman said, the prison regime now in place applies an extremely rigorous risk assessment for any temporary release from custody.
About the same time that Angus Sinclair was roaming unsupervised around Portsoy, a transformation in DNA technology was taking place. Authorities were going around prisons taking samples from all the major sex criminals, Sinclair was no exception, and putting their profiles onto the newly formed National DNA Database. It would be this development which helped put Sinclair in the frame in 2001 for an unsolved murder dating back to the late 1970s. But it isn't any of the cases we've told you about already this evening. There was another.
Mary Gallagher was a naive and petite 17-year-old machinist from a tight-knit family in Glasgow. She had taken a shortcut on her way to meet a friend in November 1978, just a year after World's End.
And I believe she was taken from here, or possibly the bridge, but certainly down here to 50 yards or so. And that's where Mary's body was found, just at the side of the wall. Mary would have died very quickly. So mercifully, we just hope she wouldn't have known an awful lot about it. As we're standing talking, I still got a feel about Mary Gallagher here.
Once her body had been found, and the post-mortem inquiry established that there was a small pinprick on her back, and there was a kind of similar mark on her clothing, which would tend to suggest, or the speculation was, that there was a knife held at her to take her away. Now that's where I would sit. I feel that having found out how Mary was, and as I said, she was a young, naive girl, I think she'd have been forced to go. That's my own feeling, is that she would have been forced.
Mary had been violently raped and her throat had been cut. The killer left one of his classic calling cards, a ligature fashioned from her own trousers wrapped around her neck. At first, the full horror of Mary's death was kept back from her sister, Yvonne.
Every time the news came on, we were getting sent out.
Can you remember how you felt when you were told what happened?
What did it do to the family, this news?
My man knew she had to go on because she had the rest of us. Know what I mean? And he taken my man's daughter away, my sister away. Nobody got the chance to know her, get to know her. As I say, we were just tore us all apart.
Strathclyde Police launched a full cold case review in 1998. Brian Murphy's team doggedly pursued leads, but it would be DNA evidence that would put Angus Sinclair right at the scene of the crime.
There was something on the pubic hair, so our own lab in Strathclyde Police looked at the sample, and they established there was actually semen on the sample. We got a semen sample, we were able to DNA profile the sample, and when we checked on the DNA database, it was identified as Angus Sinclair, which was quite a dramatic time.
This wouldn't be the only time his DNA would be recovered from a dead girl. Now it was time to confront Sinclair.
And how did he react?
He wilted. He literally physically wilted in front of me. He staggered, and he kind of lost his feet for a second or two. But he composed himself quite quickly. But there was certainly a shock factor, undoubtedly.
But he denied it, and the case went to court. The final insult for the Gallaghers was Sinclair's claim that his DNA was on Mary because they'd had consensual sex, a defence he would use again in later years. But the jury was having none of it. For the first time in his adult life, he was put away for murder.
Do you think you'd ever see this day?
No, we never ever thought we would see this day.
Been a long time coming.
And
We never gave up, just put it that way, we never gave up. We knew someday he'd be caught, and the day that's him, he's away.
The Gallaghers never gave up, but for the family of World's End victim Helen Scott, their search for justice had taken a heavy toll.
Every day, or during the night especially, I sometimes sit quite a long time during the night thinking about it, about when it's going to be solved. It's been a living sorrow to my whole family, really. I feel until whoever did it is brought to justice, we'll never get real peace of mind. I do wish he would give himself up.
Margaret Scott passed away just shortly after this interview was filmed. She wouldn't live to see her daughter's killers identified.
Her health was never the same after this, right from day one. And in fact, she carried the identikit pictures out of the paper in her purse, and And she used to do that. You'd be out and you were looking at people, you know, rightly or wrongly, strangers. And you think, oh, could that be him?
DNA had proved the key in the Mary Gallagher case, but could it unlock any of the other unsolved murders? Well, in 2004, detectives got the break they'd been waiting for. Another DNA discovery would prompt police to launch a final assault on the World's End. This Operation Trinity would also look at the Glasgow cases, and for the very first time, all 6 were being treated as connected. After almost 30 years, detectives had finally identified a suspect, and they were closing in.
For the first time, we have a positive line of inquiry and have some indications that a number of murders committed throughout Scotland during the late 1970s may be connected.
Operation Trinity, led by Tom Wood, was the largest historical investigation of its kind and involved Strathclyde and Lothian Borders. Tenacious police work and cutting-edge science was about to unlock the mystery of World's End. The coat used to identify Helen all those years ago was finally giving up its secrets.
We found there was a patch on Helen's coat which was saturated in materials which we thought were perhaps secretions of semen. So obviously we looked at them very carefully and used them very sparingly. We hoped that if we just took our time and judged our intervention carefully, science might intersect with what we had.
And that's exactly what happened. For the first time, scientists were able to identify 2 male profiles which they believed belonged to the 2 men who'd been in the pub with the girls all those years ago.
So when we put the second sample, the one that we just discovered, on the database, bang, got a match straight away. Angus Sinclair, the man we've been looking for since 1977.
Despite usually working alone, it was clear that on this occasion, Sinclair had an accomplice. Some ingenious detective work would later identify him as Gordon Hamilton, Sinclair's brother-in-law.
He was a bit of an enigma. He was a loner, an associate of Sinclair. However, he had died in 1996.
And that meant there was only one person left from that night who could really tell you what happened.
That's right, Angus Sinclair.
So Operation Trinity could now prove that Sinclair was involved at World's End because of his DNA. There were no forensics from the Glasgow cases, but detectives built up a strong circumstantial case around the killer's MO. And if behavioural evidence was to be the key, it was time to turn to the world's foremost experts, the FBI.
They brought 6 cases, and really the request for us was, can you look at all 6 of these cases and render an opinion about whether you think these cases are linked or not? And we requested all the case information, photographs, autopsy, really anything that they had back from 1977.
Special Agent Safarik spent 4 months poring over all the evidence with a fresh, independent eye. This is the first time he's spoken publicly about his work with Operation Trinity.
We were looking at victimology, we were looking at motivation, location where the girls were taken, similarities or dissimilarities in the victims. What was the cause of death? What was the weapon that was used? How were they transported or moved? Where were their bodies found? How were their bodies disposed of?
His conclusions would point directly at the man Trinity already had in its sights.
Well, our conclusions were that clearly the Scott and Edie cases were linked to each other, and we knew that going in because they were linked forensically. We didn't have a forensic linkage between the first 3 homicides and then the last homicide with Cooney. But after our analysis, it was really clear to me, I felt very strongly, that all these crimes had been committed by the same offender.
So detectives headed back from Washington, buoyed with the independent confirmation they'd been hoping for, to allow them to charge Angus Sinclair with all 6 murders.
But there were 2 major problems.
Strathclyde police had lost all of the forensic evidence relating to the unsolved Glasgow murders. But even more embarrassingly, in the case of Francis Barker, the first victim of the sequence, someone was already in prison for that murder and had been for 30 years. So despite powerful circumstantial evidence being gathered by Operation Trinity and confirmed by the FBI, the Crown opted against opening this can of worms. It decided to drop all 4 Glasgow cases and went all out for World's End.
Some breaking news within the last hour.
A man has been formally charged with the notorious World's End murders in Edinburgh 29 years ago. 2 teenagers...
But just before the trial started, as he did with Mary Gallagher, Sinclair claimed his semen was on the girls as they'd had consensual sex. He blamed his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton, for the murders, but he couldn't take the stand because he'd been dead for more than 10 years.
So here you have the circumstances where Angus Sinclair claims to have had consensual sex with these girls. His DNA is literally all over them, but that they died in and about that same time. Well, Angus Sinclair was hoping to persuade you that yes, he had consensual sex with these girls and that he left them hale and hearty and that some awful circumstance overcame them in a few minutes after that time. All very unlikely.
The chances of the semen stain belonging to anyone but Sinclair were 1,000,000,000 to 1. But police also discovered his DNA on the ligatures used to bind and strangle the girls. This time, the odds were only 390 to 1, but it was still viewed as damning evidence which could counter Sinclair's consensual sex defence. But in a move which shocked police and dismayed the victims' families, prosecutor Alan Mackay decided not to use the ligature DNA. And the defence couldn't believe their luck.
Having been told about certain things that were to come up, and you're sitting waiting on it and it never happens. My view is that all evidence should be led to the jury and let them make their mind up, you know.
I still don't understand why that supporting evidence was not led, and I mean, while I can't speak for every police officer in Scotland, I certainly know that those who were on the investigation with me, who are still serving officers, and therefore obviously can't speak openly to this. I mean, there is still an amazement that it wasn't done.
Sinclair's QC, Edgar Praise, argued that there was no case to answer, but admitted that if the court had been presented with Sinclair's DNA on the ligature, he would not have been able to make that assertion. Lord Clark threw the case out. Sinclair was acquitted. The Crown's prosecutor didn't even turn up to hear the judge's verdict. A case that had taken 30 years to get to court was over in just 2 weeks.
Words can't explain how I feel. 30 years of trying to get a conclusion. I promised to my late wife that I would stick by this and get somebody brought and get justice, which honestly I don't think I've had today. Had it gone, at least had it gone to a jury, one can accept probably their decision.
It's probably one of the saddest days of my life, actually, you know. Because I was aware of people in the background. I was aware of Maureen and Margaret, the parents, the girls. And I was aware of the efforts of all the police officers that had ever worked in the past in relation to it. And
it hurt.
It hurt. It really hurt.
Following his acquittal by Lord Clark, Sinclair was sent back to Peterhead to continue his sentence for the Mary Gallagher murder. I asked eminent QC Paul McBride what he thought about the judge's decision.
There is a strong view that the matter should have been allowed to proceed to the jury. It's not my job to criticise judges. I will say this.
Would you have allowed the evidence to go? Would you have allowed the jury to take a decision?
If I'd been a trial judge in that case, of course I would have allowed the matter to go before the jury. But I'm not a trial judge. I've not been appointed and I don't have the experience.
And how certain are you that the man who was acquitted of the World's End murders, Angus Sinclair, is guilty?
I have no doubt whatsoever.
The law of double jeopardy means that Angus Sinclair could never again stand trial for these murders. But 4 years ago in England and Wales, the law changed, that if new and compelling evidence is uncovered, suspects can be retried, even in retrospective cases. So following the Crown's failure to convict Sinclair and the recriminations that followed, the government ordered a review, and last week the Scottish Law Commission delivered its verdict, and it wasn't what was expected.
All the people who've been acquitted in Scotland at the moment have the security that they can't be charged again. I do know that the law protects them, and that's what the principle is in relation to double jeopardy.
The Commission came down very strongly against making any changes retrospective, which would scupper any hopes of retrying Sinclair. It is yet another bitter blow for the families of World's End. Sinclair had escaped again. Paul McBride believes the Commission got it badly wrong.
But if one thinks of, rape cases involving children, rape cases involving adults, horrific murder cases, and new evidence of a compelling nature comes to light that wasn't available at the trial, that demonstrates beyond any question the person is guilty, is it right as a society to say that person should go free? I don't think so, and I don't think the majority of people out there, whether they're lawyers or not, should think so.
Behind the scenes, the Crown are said to be furious with the Scottish Law Commission, and no wonder, because I've learned that they have carefully preserved the trial exhibits and are re-looking at all aspects of the evidence, especially the DNA, with a view to launching a fresh prosecution. New and advanced DNA techniques might be able to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that it was indeed Angus Sinclair who tied the knots on the ligatures used to bind and strangle the girls. This would almost certainly be counted as new and compelling evidence and could throw Angus Sinclair's defence into disarray. But this would all be for nothing if the Scottish Government accepts the Commission's findings and closes out the hopes of Maireann Scott forever. Today I've learned that in a highly controversial move, the Scottish Government is set to completely ignore the Commission's recommendations on retrospective or old cases. It intends to push legislation through Parliament that will allow for the retrial of acquitted suspects on the basis of new and compelling evidence being found. And that would leave the door wide open to bring Angus Sinclair back to the dock. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice believes that if new evidence is found, even in historical cases, then the Crown's hands should not be tied.
A decision to re-prosecute the particular individual regarding the World's End murder would be a matter for the law officers. What I can say is, as a government, we're minded that they should have that right to decide. Whether they do so will be a matter for them. If they decide to do so, they'll have our full support.
Double jeopardy is now likely to be repealed early next year. Police believe Angus Sinclair has committed at least 8 murders, but he's been convicted of just 2. Now 64, he is eligible for parole in 2016. But maybe justice will catch up with him first, and Maireann Scott may get his wish.
I still think he should be brought to justice on the case, or any other cases if there are others, to give peace of mind to the victims of these things. Because that's what we are, we're victims of a wrongdoing. But you've got to carry on, because that's what I'm striving for. Justice. Nothing else, just justice for the girls.
If you have been affected by the issues in this evening's programme and would like details of information and support, you can call the BBC Action Line on 0800 099 099. Lines are open 24 hours a day and all calls are confidential. Calls are free from a landline, but mobile operators will charge.